Trapped in a virtual prison, a horror story. Chapter 1. The game that shouldn't exist. Ethan had always been obsessed with video games, especially horror ones. He spent hours exploring haunted mansions, escaping from digital monsters, and solving eerie mysteries. But nothing had ever truly scared him, until he discovered Echo. It started as a rumor in gaming forums, a mysterious game with no official release, no developer information, and no way to download it through normal means. Some players claimed to have found it by accident, appearing in their game library without explanation. Others said it was sent to them as a corrupted file through private messages, but every story ended the same way. Those who played it were never heard from again. Ethan laughed at the idea of a cursed game. It sounded like a cheap internet myth. But when he received an email with an attachment named echo.exe, his curiosity got the better of him. No sender, no message, just the file. Without hesitation, he installed it. The game booted up with no menu screen, just a black background and a single word: Enter. Ethan clicked. The screen flickered, and his surroundings blurred for a second, like a glitch in reality itself. Then, the game loaded. He found himself standing in a dimly lit hallway, walls stretching endlessly in both directions. The graphics were hyper-realistic, almost indistinguishable from real life. A message popped up in red letters. There is no escape. Ethan smirked. Creepy, but I've seen scarier. He started walking. The sound of his footsteps echoed unnaturally, almost like something was mimicking him. The deeper he went, the more unsettling the environment became. The walls seemed to shift when he wasn't looking. The lighting flickered, casting strange shadows that didn't match his movements. Then he noticed something terrifying. In the distance, a figure stood perfectly still, barely visible in the darkness. It had no face, just a smooth, featureless surface where eyes and a mouth should be. Ethan moved forward, his heartbeat picking up. As he approached, the figure vanished. The screen glitched violently. Then, a whisper echoed through his headset. You shouldn't be here. For the first time in his life, a game made him feel truly afraid. But the worst part? He wasn't sure if he was still in the game, or if it had started playing with reality itself. Chapter 2. The Door That Shouldn't Open. Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he stared at the screen. The words, "Welcome to Level 2," flickered for a moment before disappearing. The game didn't return him to the hallway. Instead, the screen showed a pitch-black void. A low hum vibrated through his headset, a sound so deep it made his chest feel heavy. Then, slowly, a new scene faded in. Ethan's character stood in front of a massive wooden door, its surface covered in deep claw marks. The wood looked aged, almost rotting, yet the handle gleamed like polished metal. Open the door, the text on the screen urged. He hesitated. This didn't feel like a normal horror game. Every fiber of his being screamed at him not to continue. But his curiosity was stronger than his fear. He pressed the key. The door creaked open with an agonizingly slow groan, revealing nothing. A pitch-black abyss stretched beyond the threshold. No floor, no walls, just an empty void. Ethan tried stepping back, but his character moved forward on its own. No. The screen flickered violently, and the game pulled him in. The last thing he saw before the screen went black was a reflection. His own face, distorted and stretched into a silent scream. Then, something changed. His room, once dimly lit by his monitor, was now completely dark. His hands, still resting on the keyboard, felt wrong. The sensation of plastic keys was gone, replaced by something cold and smooth. He reached for his phone, but his fingers found nothing but air. Something was off. He looked around. His walls, his desk, his entire room was missing. He wasn't in his house anymore. He was inside the game. The darkness around him wasn't just an empty screen. It was a real, tangible void. A pressure weighed on his chest, like he was being watched by something lurking in the abyss. A whisper drifted through the void, a voice both distant and intimate, echoing in his skull. "Welcome, player." The words weren't on a screen anymore. They were real. Ethan's breath came in short gasps. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't VR. He had been pulled in. Then, in the distance, a faint light flickered to life. A single dimly glowing torch appeared, floating in midair. Beneath it, a figure stood motionless. Ethan's stomach twisted. The figure was wearing his own clothes, and when it turned to face him, he saw that it had his own face, except its eyes were completely empty. Then it smiled and took a step forward. Chapter 3. The echo of myself Ethan's heartbeat pounded in his ears as he stared at the figure in front of him. His own reflection, but wrong. The copy's smile was too wide, its teeth just a little too sharp, its empty eyes locked onto him, unblinking. Then, it moved. Not like a normal person. It jerked forward, its body shifting in unnatural, glitchy motions, as if it were skipping frames in a corrupted video. Ethan stumbled back. "What the hell is this?" His voice echoed strangely in the empty space, as if the void itself was listening. The clone tilted its head, its mouth moving silently before a distorted voice came through. "Why are you here?" Ethan's fingers twitched. Every instinct told him to run, but there was nowhere to go, just endless blackness stretching in every direction, except for the dim torch floating between them. The clone took another step, then another, each movement sending a wave of cold air rushing toward Ethan. "You don't belong here," it whispered. Ethan clenched his fists, trying to steady himself. "I didn't choose to be here, let me out!" The clone let out a distorted chuckle, its head twitching slightly. Then it lifted its hand, palm up. In its grasp was something that made Ethan's blood run cold. His own headset. His real-life headset. How? His breath hitched as the clone grinned wider, its fingers tightening around the device until it snapped, in half. Sparks flickered from the broken pieces, and the moment the clone destroyed it, a searing pain shot through Ethan's skull. He collapsed to his knees, clutching his head. It felt like something was breaking inside him, like a connection being forcibly severed. The void around him pulsed, shifting like a living entity. When the pain finally subsided, Ethan lifted his head, his vision swimming. The clone was gone. But the torchlight remained, flickering weakly in the dark. Ethan forced himself to his feet. His entire body felt lighter, almost disconnected, as if he wasn't fully there. Panic clawed at his mind, but he forced it down. He needed to focus. Then, new words materialized in the air in front of him, glowing like text in a game. Level 3. Find the exit. A distant sound echoed through the void, a door creaking open somewhere behind him. Ethan turned slowly. In the distance, a narrow doorway had appeared, barely illuminated by the torch's glow. There was no other option. He stepped forward. The void shifted around him, and as he passed through the doorway, the world changed. He was no longer in darkness. He stood in a long, dimly lit hallway, stretching endlessly in both directions. The walls were covered in peeling, stained wallpaper, and the air was thick with the scent of damp wood. Flickering ceiling lights buzzed faintly overhead. It looked like an old apartment building. Something about it felt wrong. Then, Ethan heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping. Footsteps. Someone, or something, was walking toward him from the far end of the hallway. He squinted into the dim light, his breath catching as a shadowy figure appeared at the edge of his vision. It wasn't moving normally. It was glitching, just like his clone had, and it was coming straight for him. Chapter 4. The Glitching Shadow. The figure at the end of the hallway twitched unnaturally, its body stuttering forward like a corrupted game file. Its movements weren't fluid. 1 second, it stood several feet away. The next, it was much closer. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Then it vanished, not into the darkness, not behind anything, just gone. The hallway was silent, except for the faint hum of the flickering lights. Ethan took an uneasy step backward, his pulse hammering against his ribs. His mind screamed at him to run, but where? The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, identical in every way. Then, just as he was about to make a move, SKRKKKK, a horrible static-like screech erupted behind him. Ethan spun around, just in time to see something wrong. The figure was right there, inches from his face. It wasn't just a shadow. It was him, another copy, but more distorted. Its face flickered between different expressions. Some Ethan recognized, some he didn't. It opened its mouth, but instead of words, a warbled, overlapping series of voices poured out. Some deep, some high-pitched, some in languages Ethan didn't understand. "Why are you here?" it repeated. Ethan bolted. He didn't care where he was running. He just knew he had to get away. His feet pounded against the rotting floorboards as he sprinted down the hallway, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The lights above him flickered wildly. The walls shifted. The wallpaper peeled back as if revealing something underneath, something pulsing like veins. The entire hallway seemed to be alive, watching him, shifting just out of his vision. Then, the air changed. A cold, metallic scent filled his nose, like blood. He didn't stop running. A door appeared ahead, slightly ajar. Ethan lunged for it, shoving it open, and suddenly he was falling. The floor beneath him had vanished. For a split second he saw, glitching fragments of different rooms, his childhood bedroom, an empty subway station, a hospital corridor, flashing around him like corrupted data. Then, thud. He hit the ground hard. Everything went still. The air was warm, stale. Ethan groaned, pushing himself up. He was no longer in the hallway. He was in a classroom. Dust floated in the air, illuminated by the faint reddish glow from the windows. The desks were neatly arranged, papers still scattered across them as if abandoned in a hurry. A massive chalkboard stood at the front, covered in strange scribbled equations. A low click echoed behind him. The classroom door had just locked itself. Ethan's stomach twisted. Then he heard the whisper, soft, right next to his ear. "Welcome back." Chapter 5. The Classroom That Shouldn't Exist. Ethan's breath came in short, shallow gasps as he turned to face the locked classroom door. His pulse hammered in his ears, drowning out the eerie silence that filled the room. The whisper he had just heard still lingered in his mind, sending a cold shiver down his spine. Welcome back. Back? Back where? He had never been here before. At least, not that he remembered. The classroom was bathed in an unnatural reddish glow, seeping in through the dirty, cracked windows. Dust swirled in the air, catching the dim light like tiny floating spirits. The old wooden desks were arranged neatly, yet something about them felt off, like they had been placed there by something that didn't fully understand how a classroom was supposed to look. Ethan took a cautious step forward, the floorboards creaking under his weight. The sound echoed strangely, as if the room was far larger than it appeared. He approached the chalkboard at the front of the room, his eyes narrowing at the bizarre scribbles covering its surface. Equations, symbols, and fragments of sentences written in different handwriting styles overlapped chaotically, creating a tangled mess of information that made no sense. His fingers brushed against the chalk tray, and the moment he touched it, a sharp, high-pitched noise rang through the air, like a tuning fork struck against metal. Ethan winced, covering his ears as the sound drilled into his skull. The room flickered, just for a second, like a corrupted game screen struggling to render. Then the chalk began to move on its own. Ethan's breath hitched as he watched the white stick scrape against the board, leaving behind a single word in jagged, uneven strokes. "Run!" A deep, guttural growl vibrated through the room. Ethan spun around, his heart nearly stopping. The door at the back of the classroom had changed. It was no longer the simple wooden door he had entered through. Now, it was tall, metal, covered in deep, rusted scratches, as if something had tried to claw its way out, or in. A loud, rhythmic pounding came from the other side. Bang, bang, bang. Something was trying to get in. Ethan backed away, his legs trembling. He had to find another way out. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an exit. But there was none, just the windows, too high and too narrow to escape through. The pounding on the door grew more aggressive. Bang, bang, bang. Then, silence. Ethan barely had a second to process before the door burst open with an ear-splitting screech. The light in the room flickered violently, casting erratic shadows that danced across the walls like living creatures. And then, it stepped in. A figure loomed, in the doorway, impossibly tall, its head nearly scraping the ceiling. Its body was wrapped in what looked like glitching, pixelated static, shifting and distorting as if it couldn't fully exist in this reality. Its limbs were long and wrong, bending at angles that made Ethan's stomach churn. Then it turned, its head toward him. Where a face should have been, there was only a void, an empty blackness that swallowed the dim light around it. But Ethan felt its gaze, heavy and paralyzing, pressing down on him like an unseen force. It took a step forward. Ethan's instincts kicked in. He turned and bolted toward the desks, leaping over chairs and knocking papers to the floor. The creature moved fast, too fast, phasing in and out of existence, 1 second near the door, the next much closer. He reached the opposite side of the room and grabbed the nearest desk, shoving it over to create a barrier. It wouldn't stop that thing, but maybe it would slow it down. The creature shrieked, a piercing digital wail that made the air itself vibrate. The windows shattered, glass spraying across the floor like tiny daggers. Ethan ducked, covering, his head as the sound drilled into his skull. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. A trapdoor. It was hidden beneath one of the desks, its edges barely visible beneath the layer of dust. Hope surged through him. Without wasting a second, he lunged forward, grabbing the handle and yanking it open. Darkness. A deep, endless void stretched beneath the trapdoor, just like the one he had seen earlier in the game. But this time, he didn't hesitate. With the creature shrieking behind him, he jumped. For a moment, there was nothing. No sound. No weight. Just the sensation of falling through an empty abyss. Then, thud. Ethan hit solid ground, the impact knocking the air from his lungs. He coughed, rolling onto his side, his head spinning from the sudden change in gravity. When he opened his eyes, he realized he was no longer in the classroom. He was standing in a hallway, but not just any hallway. It was his hallway, the one from his apartment. His chest tightened. Had he escaped? Was he back in the real world? He took a step forward, his fingers brushing against the familiar texture of the wall. The dim ceiling light flickered weakly above him, casting warm, yellowish hues on the wooden floor. But something felt off. The silence was too heavy, the air too still. Then he noticed it. His front door was open, just slightly, A thin sliver of darkness seeped through the gap, curling like tendrils into the hallway. Ethan swallowed hard, his body frozen in place. And then, from within the darkness, he heard it. A whisper. You never left. Chapter 6. The apartment that wasn't his. Ethan's breath hitched. His apartment door stood ajar, its frame swallowed by a thick, inky blackness that seemed to pulse like a living thing. The whisper still lingered in the air, sending a deep chill through his body. He wasn't home. Not really. He stepped forward cautiously, pushing the door open wider. The darkness resisted, clinging to the edges like tar before slowly peeling away. Inside, his apartment looked normal. The couch, the TV, the cluttered desk, everything was exactly where he had left it before playing Echo. But something was wrong. The air smelled different, stale and metallic like rusted iron. The lights flickered at odd intervals, their glow casting shifting, distorted shadows. And then he saw it, his reflection. It was in the TV screen, standing perfectly still. But Ethan wasn't moving. Then, his reflection smiled and took a step forward, out of the screen. Chapter 7. The echoing corridor. Ethan stumbled back, his heart hammering against his ribs. The figure that had been his reflection now stood before him, its body slightly transparent, like a flickering image on an old screen. Its eyes, his eyes, were empty, hollow voids that seemed to stretch into infinity. Who are you? Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. The doppelganger tilted its head, mirroring his movement perfectly. Then it spoke, its voice layered with static, an eerie distortion of his own. I am what remains, and soon you will be too. The apartment trembled, the walls shifting like a corrupted rendering, and Ethan knew he had to run. Chapter 8. The Shattered. Illusion. Ethan spun on his heel, sprinting toward the front door. His heartbeat roared in his ears as he grabbed the handle and yanked. Locked. The air thickened, pressing against his chest like an invisible weight. Behind him, the doppelganger took slow, deliberate steps forward. Each movement sent a flicker of static through the air, distorting reality itself. You can't run, it whispered, voice layered with echoes. You're already part of it. Ethan's fingers fumbled against the lock, desperate. He turned the knob again. No give. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw something shift. The walls were melting. Not like wax, but like digital textures breaking apart, revealing something underneath. The apartment's wallpaper peeled away in jagged, glitching lines, exposing a darkness that writhed and pulsed like a living organism. Panic surged through Ethan. He turned toward the window. Maybe he could break it, climb out. But as he took a step forward, the floor beneath him collapsed. He fell, not into another room, not into his apartment building, into nothing. An endless black void swallowed him whole, stretching in all directions. His screams faded, devoured by the silence. And then, thud. Ethan hit the ground hard, the impact rattling his bones. He groaned, rolling onto his side, his vision swimming. Where was he? The air was heavy, damp, filled with a low mechanical hum that vibrated through his skull. Slowly, he pushed himself up, his hands meeting a cold, metallic floor. A red glow flickered to life above him. He looked up. Rows of screens lined the walls, their flickering images pulsing in erratic bursts. Each one displayed him, running, screaming, trapped in different versions of his apartment, the classroom, the hallway. Different variations of himself, looping, repeating. A pit formed in Ethan's stomach. This wasn't real. None of it was real. And then, from the darkness, a voice whispered, "You were never meant to leave." A figure emerged, not the doppelganger. Something worse. Something watching. Something waiting. And Ethan knew. The game wasn't over. It had only just begun. Chapter 9. The Final Level. The hum around Ethan grew louder, vibrating through his skull as he stared at the rows of screens. Each one displayed a fragmented image of himself, twisted and distorted, running in panic, pleading for escape, always looping back to the same nightmare. He couldn't tear his eyes away. The reality around him felt thin, like it could crumble at any moment. The walls, if they could even be called walls, shifted, flickered, and sometimes vanished entirely, revealing endless voids, just like the one he'd fallen into before. The metallic floor beneath him was cold and slick, the air thick with the stench of rust and decay. "You were never meant to leave." The voice came again, deep and resonant, a low growl that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. His skin prickled with the sensation of something watching him, something far beyond the reaches of this twisted, corrupted reality. Out of the darkness, a figure stepped forward. It wasn't the doppelganger this time. It wasn't anything like what he had seen before. It was something worse. Something older, more ancient. It towered over him, its form flickering in and out of focus like a badly corrupted file. Its body was a mass of shifting pixels, pieces of it blinking in and out of existence. The face, it was like a mask, a shifting, swirling mass of eyes, mouths, and strange ancient symbols that Ethan couldn't understand. The figure's presence filled the room, its dark energy suffocating, pressing in on him from all sides. Ethan stumbled backward, but no matter where he stepped, he couldn't escape its gaze. The thing's eyes, if they could even be called eyes, followed his every move. Its expression was unreadable, an endless void of hunger and malice. The screens around him flickered, showing his distorted, terrified face, the empty classroom, the hallway that went on forever. The game was still running. He was still inside. It. Why? Ethan rasped, his voice hoarse with fear and exhaustion. Why me? The creature's lips, if they could be called lips, twitched. A deep, low chuckle reverberated through the air. You are not a player. You are a part of the system. You always have been. Ethan's stomach twisted. He didn't understand. What did it mean? It's too late for you to understand, Ethan, the creature whispered. Its voice was no longer just one voice, but hundreds, overlapping, echoing through his mind. The game is infinite. You are its creation, its echo. The screens around him exploded in a burst of static, then flickered back on. But now the images on the screens weren't just from the game. They were from his life, his childhood, his teenage years, his past, blurring together in a chaotic montage. He could see his own face, now reflected in each of the screens. He was no longer just a player. He was part of the game, part of something far worse than he could have ever imagined. The figure took a slow, deliberate step toward him. Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears. He had no escape. The doorways, the trapdoors, the familiar hallways, none of it was real. None of it had ever been real. The walls, once solid, began to melt. The floor cracked open, revealing the same, endless void that had swallowed him before. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything went dark. Ethan fell once more, but this time, it wasn't into nothingness. This time, there was no ground to hit, no walls to break his fall. This time, there was only silence. And in that silence, Ethan heard a faint click. the sound of a new game starting. Chapter 10. The reset Ethan's eyes snapped open. He was sitting at a desk, his fingers frozen above a keyboard. His apartment was exactly as he remembered it. Cluttered, but familiar. The dim light from the computer screen glowed softly in the room. The familiar hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. The faint sound of traffic outside. Everything was normal. Too normal. His heart raced. Was it over? Had he finally escaped? But something was wrong. His reflection in the dark screen stared back at him. A calm, collected version of himself, perfectly still. Ethan swallowed, his throat dry. Then he saw it. The mouse cursor, hovering over the play button. It was as though it had never been clicked before. Ethan's hand shook as he reached for the mouse. He hesitated. He didn't want to click it. He didn't want to go back, but deep down, he knew that the choice was never his to make. The game had always been waiting for him to return. His finger trembled as it hovered over the button. Then, without warning, the reflection in the screen blinked and smiled. Ethan froze. The doppelganger, his reflection, reached out of the screen once more, and everything went dark. The game had just begun.